Well, greetings, everyone. Once again, this is Yisrayl Hawkins coming to you from the House of Yahweh in Abelin, Texas, and this is the Prophetic Word Program. Now, several programs now have been bringing you how the prophecies are being fulfilled and actually how profaneness has come into the world, sickness and disease. And I want to try to get to showing you in the Holy Scriptures themselves where the real cause of this almost 100 cancers that we have children being born with today. Yes, that's true. Near to 100 cancers now that our children are being born with, and some of these are in the brain itself when a child is born. Brain and other nervous system cancers are the second most common cancers in children, making up about 21% of childhood cancers. Now, something is badly wrong. Anyone could see this. The environmentalists and certain people are blaming the chemical companies. The industrialized countries, of course, are using chemicals in their products and even getting them in our food and water supply. However, there is no proof. This is the problem. And when they go to law to try to get the law changed, of course, to where they cannot produce or use a certain chemical, they have to produce proof, which they don't have. And this becomes a problem. But now I want everybody to start thinking on this, because before the nations became industrialized like they are today, to where they're using scientific methods, chemicals, and so forth, to make plastics or cups or glasses or whatever they're making with them. Before this, we had cancers shown in 6,000 years ago. These cancers were present and in many people. And Yahweh says before this, He said, don't break these laws right here, or you will have these diseases. Well, cancer is some of the diseases that He named in that process when He was giving His laws and saying, don't do this, or you will cause this to come upon your body. Well, of course, a lot of this was fornication and adultery, but there's more to it than that. I want to get to that today if I possibly can. But a lot of it was fornication, adultery, bestiality, and of course sodomy. Sodomy, as I brought to you about the tribes of Israel who rejected Yahweh, the Aaronitic priesthood, as the Catholic Church calls themselves, and they say they trace back and hold roots in the Aaronitic priesthood. Well, Malachi Martin, a Catholic writer, brought this out in The Keys of This Blood. The keys of this bloodline is what he was talking about, and saying that the Catholics, their roots date back there. That is, their ancestors do. If you remember the violent priest who took over the temple, Yeshua said the violent men are taking it by force. And this was the priest he is talking about. These were of the 12 tribes, the family that Yahweh brought out of this land of Egypt. And He says, you only have I known of all the families of the earth. And he said, Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, was saying that from them profaneness had gone out to all the earth, and they had become as Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah, because of the sodomy that they were establishing and practicing at that time by permission of some god. I don't remember the name of the god that supposedly gives them permission to do this to young boys. But this going on behind closed doors, and now this what went on now is being exposed, and what is going on is being exposed, and so a lot of trouble is arising from this. But this came from the Aaronitic priesthood that rejected Yahweh in 1 Samuel 8 And is shown then, the prophets were sent to them, Jeremiah, Isaiah, all of them sent to them, telling them what you're doing has cut you off from Yahweh and the kingdom. There's no salvation in what you're doing. They had turned to Christmas, keeping Christmas in Jeremiah 10, in worship of the pagan sun god. In Isaiah 65 and 66, it showed that they were back to eating pork and keeping memorials to the dead, that is Halloween. Then Jeremiah 44 and 45 showed that they were worshiping the Queen of Heaven, that is Mary, the Queen of Heaven. All the practices that you see in the Catholic Church today was condemned by the prophets. Well, the prophets also said, because you have transgressed the law, changed the ordinance. Let's read that. Isaiah 24, start with verse 1 here. He shows that the cause of what we're seeing today and the cause of the nuclear war that's going to come very, very soon. Verse 1 and 2 says he's going to allow the earth to be almost totally emptied. Almost. Few men left. It's going to be upon the people as well as the priest. Verse 4 says the earth mourns and fades away. The earth also is defiled unto the inhabitants of it, because they've transgressed the law, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant. Because of this, the curse has devoured the earth. Because they've transgressed the law, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant, because of this, the curse has devoured the earth, and they who dwell therein are desolate. Therefore, the inhabitants of the earth will be burned, and few men left. In verse 18, he shows the foundations of the earth will be shaken. The earth is utterly broken down. The earth is dissolved clean. The earth is shaken exceedingly. The earth will reel to and fro and sway like a hut. The transgressions of it will be heavy upon it, and it will fall, not to rise again. Okay, now this is what is prophesied, and he's saying the reason for it is because the laws were changed. Well, this Aaronic priesthood who denied Yahweh and said to Samuel in 1 Samuel 8, 1 through 9, we want a king like all other nations. We don't want Yahweh to rule over us anymore. So they rejected the laws. Daniel said that the armies, he said there'd be a fourth world-ruling kingdom that would stand on the part of this religion. And of course, this is the Roman Empire that became the Holy Roman Empire. And of course, Daniel said in verse 7 that the religion would speak against Yahweh. If you want to turn with me, Daniel 7 and verse 25, it says, and he will speak great words against Yahweh, wear out the saints of Yahweh, and change the laws of Yahweh. Change the laws, the feast days and the Sabbath day laws. Well, of course, we know that Constantine said we don't want anything to do with the rebels of the Jews. So the day from now on that we will celebrate will be Sunday instead of the seventh day Sabbath, as the commandment says. Well, the commandment now is in Exodus 20. I'm just lining you up before we get into the real cause of cancer here, because there is a real cause of cancer. In chapter 20, we have the 10 commandments shown. And it says in verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you will labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of Yahweh, your heavenly Father. In it you shall do no work, you nor your wife, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your manservant or your maidservant, nor the cattle, nor the strangers, or so forth. In 6 days Yahweh made the heavens and the earth, and Yahweh rested on the seventh day. Therefore Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. And then keep these Sabbaths, and you will know it is Yahweh who sanctifies you. Now in Isaiah 66, we see that Yahweh says, this priesthood that is forming itself, that Jeremiah 23:15 says has brought profaneness to all the world. 14 says they've become as Sodom and Gomorrah to him, the Sodomites, in other words. Isaiah 66 and verse 17 said they sanctify themselves. They purify themselves in the gardens, following after the priest in the midst of those who eat swine's flesh. So here we find out they've gone back to eating swine's flesh, a meat that Yahweh says is unclean and causes you to be an abomination, and also causes you to be abominable to other people. Now, abomination means it will cause you to be sick. The Hebrew word that they translated abominable means that you can pass this on to other people. Now, this was long before chemicals. Remember this, that Yahweh prophesied this, and the prophet said that this Aaronotic priesthood who left the laws of Yahweh, rejected the laws, as Isaiah said, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant, he says they have defiled the whole earth. Jeremiah 23:15 said, from you priest of Jerusalem, profaneness has gone out to all the earth. Isaiah said, therefore the earth will have to be burned, and few men left. The Savior in Matthew 24 says that we're going to see the sun darkened, but he also prophesied great disease epidemics, the greatest ever, is going to take place, he said. Well, we see this priesthood now in Isaiah, we see it in Samuel, we see it in Daniel, we see the army joining on its part, which became the Roman Empire and then became the Holy Roman Empire. And Daniel says in chapter 11 of Daniel, he says the army will stand on the part of this religion that changes the laws and speaks against Yahweh. The army, speaking of the fourth world ruling kingdom, the Roman Empire, will stand on his part, and they will pollute the sanctuary of strength. That this is what they did. The Roman army, after Yeshua's death, resurrection, and then the ascension into heaven, where he became the high priest over the house of Yahweh. Then Titus came in. The priest left the temple, went to Babylon, and then on to Rome. Titus destroyed, he first removed the artifacts from the temple and took it to Rome. Now this is a matter of history, but it's also shown in the Holy Scripture. But if you'll read about Titus in any dictionary or encyclopedia, it will tell you that he took the artifacts out of the temple, including the Ark of the Covenant, the 7-lamp candlestand, and so forth. He took all of these golden objects and took them to Rome. After the priest had already gone to Rome, Titus came in with the army, removed the artifacts, then he burnt the temple, then he removed every stone of the temple, and plowed the land like a field, plowed Zion like a field. Now they didn't even know, they couldn't even tell that a temple ever sat there when Titus got through destroying that temple. This is what they did in many cities. The roaming army. This is where you get the word of the city, Rome, because they had an army that roamed, and they brought in people from Israel, the captives. Daniel was taken captive from Jerusalem and taken to Babylon, where the king says, bring me all the best of the best that can learn our literature, that we can teach our literature, young men that we can teach our literature, and teach to them the Chaldean language. This was a new language. They didn't want them to speak Hebrew anymore because the laws of Yahweh were written in Hebrew. So they tried to wipe out the Hebrew language. And of course, the Bibles and the manuscripts, that's all they could find. They wrote them in this Chaldees language. And this is the language they taught. when Ezra and Nehemiah, or Ezra and Nehemiah, as the King James Version calls it, when they brought some children of Israel out of Babylon by orders of the king back to rebuild Jerusalem, the people that they brought could not even speak the Hebrew language. So Ezra and Nehemiah had to read them the law and translate and explain it to them. And they cried when they found Yahweh's laws. All of that is history. But the history that I want you to see here, the army will stand on his part. That is the part of this religion. The army will stand on his part, and they will pollute the sanctuary. They did. They destroyed the sanctuary. Yeshua said in Matthew 24, in the first few verses here, the disciples came to him and asked him about the temple and the buildings. And Yeshua said to them, see all of these things. Truly I say, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. This took place in the days of Titus. Read about Titus. He removed the artifacts. The priests all went to Babylon, and then certain of them were sent on to Rome. Titus brought all the artifacts to Rome. Yes. Where they still are today. Yes. They have possession of them today. The temple was destroyed in 70 CE, after about 30 years after Yeshua made this prophecy right here. Well, the next thing you see now in the Acts of the Apostles, you see that they were trying to destroy the disciples of Yahweh that were still left in Jerusalem. And many of them had fled to places like Damascus and that is Syria and other places. But here you see in chapter 7, Stephen saying to them, in verse 51, saying to the Pharisees still in Jerusalem, you stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears, you do always resist the Holy Spirit. As your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets, he says, have not your fathers persecuted? And they have slain those who foretold the coming of the just one, of whom you now have become the betrayers and murderers. That is Yeshua. Yes, they murdered the Pharisees. They say, well, the Romans did this. The Romans were Pharisees. In fact, the Apostle Paul was a Pharisee. He was a Roman soldier. He had never been to Rome, but he was a Roman soldier, and he was a Pharisee trained in Jerusalem by the high priest, Gamaliel. Well, here he says in verse 53, you who have received the law, so it was those that they are the Aaronitic priesthood. As Malachi Martin said, the keys of this blood shows that they date back to that time and that lineage of Abraham. The Catholics do today. They came from the same lineage. Yeshua said, I know you're of the lineage of Abraham, but if you were the true children of Abraham, you would be keeping the laws as Abraham kept the laws. But he says, you seek to kill me. This was something Abraham would not do. He says, you who received the law by Moshe, the Aaronitic priesthood. That's what the keys of this blood show, that the Catholic Church has roots with the Aaronitic priesthood. They're the ones, though, that rejected the law. They didn't keep the law as the prophets did. And the prophets came and prophesied against them. Notice you received the law as it was ordained and delivered by Malachim, have not kept the law. You have not kept it. Well, go back now to the prophet Jeremiah again here. The prophet Jeremiah, in the very first chapter, he says, the sayings of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, of the priestly family that lived in Anathoth. Anathoth, the priest in Anathoth, told Jeremiah in this same book, do not prophesy to us in the name of Yahweh, or we will kill you. Okay? Anathoth, in the land of Benjamin. Benjamin, in Genesis 49, we see here a prophecy of the last days. Genesis 49 and verse 1 says, Then Jacob called for his sons and said, Gather together, so I may tell you what will befall you in the last days. One of the things he named here was the tribe of Benjamin in 27. It is a ravenous wolf. Yeshua said, I'm going to send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. He says here in Genesis, Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours his foe, and in the evening he divides his plunder, talking about crusades. Of course, he's showing you the crusades that the apostle Shaul was involved in, as we will see in just a moment. In Jeremiah chapter 1, he's saying of a tribe of Benjamin, in Anathoth of the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of Yahweh came in the days of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah. King of Judah. In the 13th year of his reign, the word of Yahweh came in the days of Joachim, son of Yeshaiah, king of Judah, until the end of the 11th year of son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the deportation of Jerusalem's captives. Until the deportation of Jerusalem's captives in the 5th moon of that year. Then the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you, and I appointed you a prophet to the nations. The nations, this was the nations of Israel. Genesis 48:19 says, You will become a multitude of nations. He also said, You'll be like the sands of the sea, that no man can number. He says, look up at the stars and count them if you can. You're going to become as the stars, in multitude, in number. Now, he says in verse 18 of this same chapter, For behold, this day I have made you a fortified city, an iron pillar, and walls of bronze against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, against the princes, against the priests, and against the people of the land. This is the Aaronic priesthood that the keys of this blood talk about. But they're the Aaronic priesthood that turned against the laws of Yahweh. Verse 19 says, They will fight against you, but they will not succeed. Well, Jeremiah is still fighting through the house of Yahweh in these last days, which he actually prophesied. So does Isaiah. So did the book of Genesis in the same chapters prophesy about the house of Yahweh and Yeshua himself being the high priest over the house of Yahweh in this time period. Here in chapter 23, he says that the priest, the prophets of Samaria, which they had also taken over the land of Samaria, and they had synagogues there, as we see in book 2. They'd already doing this in Jeremiah's time. They're spreading out, taking control of the land, including Babylon. They built Babylon. The king Nebuchadnezzar was a Hebrew that built Babylon, at least beautified it, he said, and took credit for beautifying it. And of course, they had taken over Rome, the hills of Rome at that time too. In fact, they fled from the face of Shem, history says, fled to the 7 hills of Rome. Now this was the Aaronic priesthood, of course, who actually refused the laws of Yahweh under Samuel in the 8th chapter of 1 Samuel, verses 1 through 9. Well, now here in chapter 23, In verse 10, the land is full of adulterers because of you priests. Because of this curse, the land mourns. The pleasant places of the wilderness are dried up. Their conduct is evil, whose might is not right, force, who is not right. For both the prophets and the priests are profane. Yes, even in my own house I have found their wickedness, Yahweh says. And then in verse 14, he says, the prophets of Jerusalem do a horrible thing. They commit adultery and walk in lies. He says, all of them have become Sodom, like Sodom and Gomorrah to me. The inhabitants of the land are like Gomorrah. The priests are like Sodom. They're Sodomites, in other words. This is what's being exposed about the Catholic Church today, is the sodomy that's going on there. Malachi Martin spoke of this in his book, The Keys of This Blood, and also is in his interview. Malachi Martin is dead now, but he was either murdered or died, but he died very young if he died. But he wrote the book first, and he was doing interviews when he was either murdered or died. He said, from the prophets of Jerusalem, profaneness has gone out into all the world. Now, this is the prophets of Jerusalem. Now, we look over in Acts and we can see this roaming taking place, and of course them killing Stephen here. And then we see in verse 58 that they laid, while they're stoning Stephen, they laid their coats at the feet of one Paul or Shaul. And then Shaul, as we find here in chapter 9, he was a Roman soldier who was breathing threats. He was also a Pharisee. He trained, as is shown in the book of Acts, he trained at the feet of Gamaliel, the priest, high priest. And he asked here for permission to go to Damascus. Damascus, that's in Syria, where some of the brethren had fled. And verse 27, last part, and how he had preached boldly in the name of Yahshua at Damascus. While he was on the way to Damascus, Yahshua met him and converted him to preaching the laws of Yahweh. Yes. And then later on we see here that the apostle Shaul then was arrested himself for preaching the laws of Yahweh, the written laws of Yahweh, and saying what you call heretic. That's what they called when the Crusaders went out hunting these people. Anyone who kept the laws of Yahweh was classified a heretic. They still are today. In fact, the Jesuit priests classify them as a heretic and say they deserve murder. Well, the Crusades were for that purpose. And of course, the Apostle Paul, once he started teaching the laws of Yahweh, then he was also sought after to be murdered. And in his book of Romans right here, which we will get in the very next sermon, the very next broadcast, we're going into the book of Romans here to show that this book that he wrote to the captives in Rome, some of whom he had taken, arrested himself, so he knew them, and he wrote this to them saying that the people in Rome were the Aaronitic priesthood. And the laws that they gave, Yahweh actually gave them these laws, but they rejected the laws, so Yahweh gave them up to a reprobate mind. Until next broadcast, may Yahweh bless your understanding.